Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back, what actually is it? Who are we, and why?
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country, from the White Cliffs of Dover to the Scottish Highlands of the Scottish Highlands, from old stone circles to modern stone circles, from the tranquil beauty of Roman Bath
to the golden wonder of Oxford services.
I'll discover how we went from ancient man to Ed Sheeran, why Elizabeth I happened, and solving the mystery of just who Winston Churchill was, and why he wound up helplessly trapped inside this banknote.
Along the way, I'll be shouting at helicopters
and looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them.
Why did they call John Major the Prince of Onions?
And also walking somewhere impressive with my mouth shut while my voice speaks anyway, like I'm talking aloud in my own head. All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
It's hard to imagine while you're standing in it, but there was a time before Britain, before Europe, before the world, even before the universe. Nobody can say when it was, because it was also before clocks and words. It was a time when nothing existed, empty, without motion or energy or light or hope, just like Plymouth today. Just imagine something like this orange, and then imagine it's not there. Then do that one by one with everything that exists until there's nothing at all. That's what Britain was like until the Big Bang. The Big Bang created the universe in one mad explosion that was probably deafening, although luckily ears didn't exist yet. Computers think it looked like this, although eyes also didn't exist back then either, so we can't be sure. And it was so long ago now, it's probably best not to keep dredging it up. Britain was already part of Earth, but it was scrunched in along with loads of other countries in a gigantic landmass called Pangaea. At this time, Pangaea was full of dinosaurs, a race of Godzilla monsters so scary normal human beings didn't dare exist until they'd all gone. Dinosaurs came in many flavours, just like kettle chips. As this actual footage shows, the main ones were the across ones who ate grass, and the up and down ones who ate the across ones. This tyrannical sawdust Rex is the only real dinosaur left in the world, which is probably why it's so angry, spending literally every waking moment of its life roaring helplessly at passing tourists. People wonder why the dinosaurs became extinct, although it's hardly surprising they died out when you see the barbaric conditions they're kept in zoos such as this one. Underfed, starving, some of them little more than skeletons. Luckily, the dinosaurs were soon replaced by different animals like me, man. But men like me didn't just appear fully clothed on the earth. Instead, we had to evolve. Evolution is complicated, so we've massively slowed it down here so you can see it happening. And this wasn't the only change that was happening. Pangaea was changing too. Over time, all the countries decided to split away one by one to work on solo projects, and Britain was no exception. Stone's Age man used stones to make basic weapons and tools, like these hand axes. As well as boring, these are also shit by today's standards, but back then they were cutting edge, because they had a cutting edge. The Stone's Age was all rocks, wasn't it? Are stones made of rock, or are rocks made of stone?
Both. A stone is a rock. Generally, a rock is...
And a rock is a stone?
Yeah. Generally, rocks are more edgy, more ragged varieties of stone. The Stone Age lasted a very long time. In fact, our species spent more time in the Stone Age than any other. Let's think of it this way. If you look at the human history, prehistory as a year, and so New Year's Day is where humans start to use fire and shape stone tools. And this year is the last split second before midnight at the other end of the year. Then we're in the Old Stone Age until about 3 p.m. on the 31st of December.
So rocks are more jaggedy.
You could tell Stone Age stuff was precious because they kept everything deep underground.
Why did Stone Age people bury all their stuff underground? Were they worried someone might steal it?
No, that's how we find it. It wasn't always underground. It was on the top. The reason we find it as archaeologists is that we go out and we dig it up.
Oh. But not all Stone Age things have to be dug up. Some are still visible, which means you can see them. This is Stonehenge, early man's finest achievement. To Stone Age Britons, this was a cross between Nemesis at Alton Towers, in that it was a spectacular attraction, and the queue for Nemesis at Alton Towers, in that it never fucking moves. Stonehenge was used to tell the time, which means Stonehenge is the only clock you can see from space, unless you have a clock in your spaceship. Eventually, primitive cave boffins discovered new materials. Early man dropped rocks like a stone and got into metal, bronze, and then iron. Iron Man was born.
But this Iron Man didn't have superpowers like the Iron Man in films. He couldn't fly or tolerate Gwyneth Paltrow. So instead, he had to go to lengthy measures to defend himself. Luckily, cave boffins had also invented the iron spike. And shortly after inventing the spike, they invented stabbing each other. To make sure they stabbed the right people, Britons formed into primitive gangs called tribes. And like many gangs, they got into graffiti, vandalising the countryside with gigantic doodles, like this badly drawn horse, or this decorative pervert. Before Snapchat, hills were the most efficient way to distribute dick pics to a wide audience. As a result, this site at Cerne Abbas became the second crudest hill in British history, after Benny. There's disagreement about how old the Cerne Abbas giant actually is, especially since he's still young enough to get wood. What's not in doubt is that he represents the birth of British art, being the biggest example of a noble visual tradition that's echoed down the ages. But this happy land of spikes and hill filth was about to come under threat from something nobody saw coming: Romans. Where did the Romans come from?
To begin with, they came from Rome, and then they came from the Roman Empire.
Right, but where in Britain did they come from?
Not from Britain, they came from Rome, which is in Italy.
Right, well, this is about the history of Britain, so where in Britain did they come from?
Well, the Romans came from Rome, and they headed northwards and conquered most of Europe. And then they crossed the English Channel, and they conquered about half of Britain.
And where did they go once they were in Britain?
Well, they tried to get to Scotland, but they decided it wasn't worth the effort of going there.
Yeah, I felt that.
The Romans were so advanced, they came with Latin pre-installed, and they soon taught the primitive locals how to wash and walk on their hind legs. The Romans were fearsome in battle, but soon found themselves facing resistance from some British locals known as Celts. There was heavy fighting, although according to experts, it wouldn't have quite looked like this.
Celts famously would, the warriors would strip naked, paint themselves in designs, and go into battle naked. They believed that by painting themselves in designs, that they were calling out to their gods up in the sky for protection and for courage and for help.
Did the Romans have chainmail then?
They had armour of a sort.
They had armour and they were naked.
Yeah.
Who won?
Well,
the Romans.
The Romans won in the end.
I knew it. I bet when the Celts turned up naked and saw what the Romans had on, I bet they were kicking themselves. I bet they felt stupid. But they were like, who suggested this? Having defeated the Celts, the Romans set about revolutionising British life. They built Hard Ian's Wall and put the capital of Britain in Colchester, where nobody would want to come and get it. They introduced coins and invented these primitive 8-bit computer game graphics, but couldn't make them move. What the Romans really loved was bathing, which is why they built this in the English town of Bath. No one in Britain had seen anything as sophisticated as these baths. You could think of it as an early example of gentrification, like when someone opens an artisan bakery in Hull. Imagine in ancient Britain walking into this place. He'd scarcely be able to comprehend what he was seeing. It'd be like Steve McFadden climbing on board Concorde. Perhaps most impressive of all, the Romans invented roads. Before roads was invented, you had to travel around by standing at the edge of your village and seeing how far you could jump. Despite all this, some people resisted the Roman invasion. Queen Boudicca came from Norfolk, like so many rebels. Myline Class, Ed Balls, Delia Smith. Boudicca hated the Romans. She led a barbarian army in revolt and attacked Colchester, turning it from the bustling capital into a smouldering hellhole full of weeping and despair, which you can still visit today. Rome was the most advanced warfare machine on the planet, but Boudicca's army fought back with the weapon they knew best, spikes, and lost because it's just spikes. Once Boudicca was crushed, the Romans ruled over Britain for years, until suddenly they had to rush home because they remembered they'd left a complete collapse of civilization on. Britain was left on its own. It had taken back control from the unelected bureaucrats of Rome and was free at last to explore its own proud destiny. And it did that by immediately entering the Dark Ages. We don't know a huge amount about what actually happened during the Dark Ages because the Romans had taken the last pens with them. That's probably why it became a time of myth and great heroes like King Arthur. King Arthur came a lot, didn't he?
I think you mean that he's associated with the court of Camelot.
No, it definitely says King Arthur came a lot.
Camelot.
Camelot.
Yeah, it's his court where he held court. It's a place.
All right. But do we know if he came a lot, or like just the same as an average man, like about a tablespoon?
The only evidence I have in that regard is that he is said to have had one child.
Right. So probably not.
Probably not.
Even though he didn't exist, King Arthur lived in a castle called Camelot, where he founded the Round Table, even though he didn't do that either. The Round Table was a sort of lazy Susan, which meant the knights could get at the snacks they wanted without having to move around in their armour. But perhaps the greatest British icon to emerge during the Dark Ages was mega patriot and dragon slayer St. George. We don't know where or when George slayed the dragon, but we know it definitely happened because a bystander took this painting of the event. And it probably happened somewhere in Wales. It's one of the few concrete facts to come out of the Dark Ages. Do we know for certain the dragon was threatening St. George, or do we just jump to conclusions because of the way the dragon looked?
The story of St. George killing the dragon isn't actually true because there are no dragons.
After he killed the dragon, how was he rewarded? I mean, what's better than a saint?
Well, he didn't kill the dragon because dragons don't exist. It's made up.
But is it true to say he was the greatest Englishman who ever lived?
The thing about St. George is that he wasn't actually English. His father came from the middle of what's now Turkey, and his mother came from Palestine, and he never actually came to England.
Oh, you're joking. But although St. George never bothered, lots of other foreigners did set foot in Britain, as it got invaded again and again. First by the Angles and the Saxons, and then by the notoriously brutal Vikings, who arrived from Denmark in longboats, wearing metal helmets which they'd somehow managed to pull over the terrifying skull horns that jutted from their heads.
British King Alfred of Great fought the Vikings by giving up and letting them settle in York, probably because it had the Jorvik Viking Centre. Soon interbreeding meant the Vikings lost their distinctive horns and became indistinguishable from normal humans.
For a few hundred years, Britain was relatively peaceful, until one day when a new king, Harold, was getting coronated, and Halley's Comet, a sort of very short firework display, appeared in the sky. The comet has always heralded great events. It last appeared in our skies in 1986, the same year the sitcom Brushstrokes started.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
In King Harold's day, the comet was also a sign of terrible things to come. The year was 1066.
1066 and the Battle of Hastings are probably British history's two most famous events, so it's handy they happened the same year.
Harold had a rival. In the first example of an EU national coming over here to take British jobs, a Frenchman called William set sail to seize the throne and become king.
It's amazing to think that only 1,000 years ago this field was interesting, because it was here that Harold and William's armies met. There have been many battles in Britain's history, but we don't know what happened in most of them. The Battle of Hastings is different. We've got an accurate visual record of the whole thing, thanks to a quick-thinking bystander who took a tapestry of it. Despite looking like a Game of Thrones season finale drawn by an 8-year-old boy, the Baywatch tapestry captures the full force of the battle. It's just like being there, but in wool. Here's the Norman archers, steaming in on their blue horses. Here's a sort of stick fight bit, some chopped up people down here. His head's off. You'll be furious about that. Some goose monsters in the sky looking down. Some sort of lion thing up here, eating its own tail. Is that its bumhole? I think that's its bumhole. As you can see, Harold won when he triumphantly caught an arrow in his eye. Sadly, it wasn't enough, and he died soon after. No one knows why. This meant that the Normans were victorious. At last, William the Conqueror's name made sense. William winning was like Brexit backwards. Britain was suddenly part of Europe, and that meant everything had to change. There were new castles, new cathedrals, even the Tower of London, and amazingly, all built by one man, Norman architecture. The new king wanted a list of everybody in the country, where they lived and what stuff they had. It became known as the Domesday Book and was very much the internet of its day. So is this the actual Domesday Book?
This is the actual Domesday Book, yes.
And it's usually under glass, isn't it, this book?
Well, usually it's not accessible at all, so it's very rarely on display. So this is really quite a special occasion that we've got it out for you to be able to see it today.
So you're not allowed to touch it?
No.
I thought that was because of the curse.
The curse?
Yeah, I heard that there was a curse on it.
I've definitely not heard that, so I don't think there's a curse.
I thought it was going to be like, you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where that Nazi gets his face melted off.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be like that.
I'm afraid not.
Oh. So how does the Domesday Book compare to a book like The Runaway by Martina Cole?
Well, I've not read The Runaway by Martina Cole, but
It's
I think...
really good.
OK, I think that's a work of fiction, so it's a made-up story, whereas Domesday is recording the land and landholding in England before the Norman Conquest and after the Norman Conquest. It kind of lists who holds land and what's within that land and how much it's worth, and it does that in a lot of detail. So Roger holds a land here it's just called Milderhope. It's probably going to have a different name now.
So how can we free the people living in this book?
Well, they don't live in the book.
But their souls are inside the book.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think this records information about them, but they're not in there. It's just, it's just a record about them. It doesn't sort of contain their being or anything like that. We don't need to worry about them.
You sure?
I'm sure.
The book gives us a unique insight into what life would have been like in the Middle Ages. In the medieval times, if you were lucky enough to be a king, or a knight, or a lady with a pointy hat with all nets on it, you might have lived somewhere like this. A castle. Castles were originally built by kings to protect their land and to sit in, whereas today they're mainly used as extortionate wedding venues. Of course, not everyone was a king. Everyone else was peasants. Peasants lived in thatched wooden huts full of chicken shit. The water was filthy, so everyone drank beer, and the only thing to eat was bread. It was a particularly challenging time for the gluten intolerant, but luckily nobody was yet middle class, so they just put up with it. But life for the common man was about to get better, thanks to the Magna Carta, a sort of terms and conditions notice King John had to sign against his will, which limited his powers and gave citizens basic rights. The Magna Carta kick-started the whole of British political history, a history so complex, even experts can no longer keep track of it. What's the most political thing that's ever happened in Britain?
I'm not sure. I think. Gosh, that's a tricky question in the sense that there are definitely degrees of. Gosh, what's the most political? There are lots of things that are straightforwardly political, and then there are other things that are not. They're sort of halfway, I guess. But I genuinely can't identify the most political.
Second most? Meanwhile, back in history, by the Middle Ages, medieval England was such a big deal. It was even happening in Scotland. The Scots have always been a proud, confident nation, ready to complain if they think they've not been given their own little section in a landmark history programme. But in 1296, Scotland was reluctantly under the rule of English Edward I. One man wanted out, William Willis. No one knew what William Willis looked like until 1995, when Hollywood scientists discovered he looked exactly like Mel Gibson, who was coincidentally playing a Scottish Apache in a film called Braveheart, a sort of Scottish reboot of Dancing with Wolves.
That they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
Sensitively informing modern audiences about a story little known outside Scotland, the film emotively and expertly depicted William as he gathered a band of noble warriors and defeated the English army at Stirling Bridge using face paint and extreme whittling.
To this day, the words Stirling Bridge conjure pride in every Scotsman's heart, while to an Englishman those same words conjure up literally no feelings at all. But his glory days weren't to last, and Willis and his men were defeated by the English at Falkirk. With Willis gone, a posh Scotsman called Robert E. Bruce thrashed the English at the Battle of Bannockburn and took the throne. Scotland would never again be under English control, for a bit. Willis, meanwhile, was eventually captured by the English and taken to London, where he was publicly hung, drawn and quartered. This means he was hung by his neck. Then while he was still alive, his guts were chopped out and his body cut into 4 quarters. Something you can ask your local butcher to do to a chicken.
Once it had stopped screaming, Willis's severed head was placed atop a pike on London Bridge, like a sort of gory Scottish Pez. Willis's execution kicked off a golden age of public entertainment. As well as watching people die painfully, popular pastimes included bear baiting, shin kicking and cockfighting, which isn't what it sounds like, even though I checked twice. But British culture wasn't just being cruel to animals, it was also bum jokes. And the William Shakespeare of bum jokes was Geoffrey Chaucer.
His greatest work was the Canterbury Tales, which everyone has pretended to have read at least some of.
His stories feature lots of bawdy shenanigans, a literary phrase which means knockers popping out, or things unexpectedly going up your arse, accompanied by a sort of swanny whistle noise. Chaucer's meant to be quite rude, isn't he? Could you describe a rude bit for me?
So there's a very famous scene where there's a woman, a very pretty woman called Alison, who everyone fancies, and she's in her bedroom with one lover, and then another would-be lover arrives at the window to serenade her and begs her for a kiss, and she sticks her arse out of the window, her naked arse, and he kisses that very enthusiastically, and then suddenly realises what he's done and is quite upset and runs away.
Right, that's not very rude, is it? Like, my mate Paul told me this joke about this bloke in prison who wore a bib round his backside, and that story went places I wasn't prepared for. Like, not even funny, just disturbing. And when I looked up, Paul was crying. But it wasn't all chuckles in the Middle Ages. In 1348, Britain was invaded again, but this time by a plague. Not a metaphorical plague like a metaphorical plague, but an actual plague, made of plague. The Black Death symptoms were disgusting. Discoloured buboes grew in the groin and armpits, making even a light workout next to impossible. If you had sex with someone who had the Black Death, would you have to use a condom for protection?
It depends what your major concerns were. But you wouldn't be protecting yourself against infection.
How long would you get off work if you got the Black Death?
In about 70% of cases, you'd be off work forever.
Oh, right. Result?
Because you'd be dead.
Oh. Roughly half the population died, which statistically meant that if you wanted to save your loved ones, you'd have to die yourself. The Middle Ages started like a fancy dress party and ended like Halloween. But once it had got its strength back and grown some more people, England descended into 30 glorious years of violent conflict between rival royal houses. The War of the Roses, which sounds like a sitcom about florists, but perhaps surprisingly wasn't. This was an incredibly complex period of history, which is frustrating because we've got to get it out of the way in this episode, and we spent too long talking about Mel Gibson earlier. The War of the Roses is a complicated struggle, but could you sum it up for my viewers in like 3 words?
Conspiracy, dynasty, war.
Could you do it a bit more thoroughly than that? I'll give you 10 seconds. Start.
It's a struggle to control England and the crown.
I've got a few more seconds.
Between warring
dynasties. Perhaps the most violent event of the War of the Roses was the Battle of Bosworth, which Richard III tried to escape by burrowing under a car park. He hid down there for centuries before finally emerging in 2013, by which point the war was over and he died of tarmac inhalation. Richard III may have died, but he gave birth to a series of celebrity kings and queens, the Tudors, very much the Kardashians of British history.
But that's a story that'll have to wait for now. Join me next time when I go back in time again. Not in an exciting way like in a film. I'm probably just looking at some old pots or something.
How can we be sure Henry VIII is who we think he was? What if he was someone else just pretending to be himself, who happened to look like whoever he actually was?
Well...
Diane Morgan, along with Joe Wilkinson, parody footage from the archives. They are the Archiveologists, available now on BBC iPlayer. Also online, let's head for the Cotswolds. You can see all from Series 1 of BBC Three's This Country.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back, what actually is it? Who are we, and why?
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country. From the White Cliffs of Dover to the Scottish Highlands of the Scottish Highlands.
On my Odyssey, I'll be starting sentences in one location and finishing them in another.
And looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them.
Henry didn't get arrested after he killed his first wife, did he? What sort of mistakes did the Tudor police make that led him to kill again?
All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
Last week, we discovered how God invented Britain, who the Romans were, and why we went to war with the Roses. But that was just the beginning. By the time the Wars of the Roses ended, Britain was literally on the map, somewhere near the top, showing how important it was.
The British had a firm grasp of the solid parts of the country, like this rock. But there was a load of stuff around the edges that wouldn't do as it was told. It was wet, it was full of fish, and it wouldn't make up its mind how close to the rock it wanted to be.
In this episode, I'll discover how Britain came to rule the waves and invent the empire.
It's a story about events beyond Britain's coastline, so I'll be using the C word a lot.
Sea. This is Hampton Court Palace, a building so impressive it has to be accompanied by harpsichord music.
These days, Hampton Court is open 10 till 4:30 in the winter, 10 till 6 in the summer, with last entry to the maze 45 minutes before closing. Prices start at £18.40 per adult and £9.20 per child. A family ticket will set you back at least £32.30, unless you're buying that ticket in the 15th century and your family name is Tudor.
But what do we mean by the word Tudor? Let's ask an expert.
What do we mean by the word Tudor?
The word Tudor is quite controversial because the Tudors at the time didn't call themselves Tudor. Tudor is the family name, the Welsh family name of the ancestors on the father's side of King Henry VII, but the only person who calls Henry VII Henry Tudor is Richard III when he's trying to stop him becoming king. And he uses the name Tudor just to mean this is some random Welsh person rather than an appropriate person to replace me as king. So the Tudors don't use the name Tudor very much at all. Some people refer to it as being their family name later on.
Sorry, I had that thing, you know, where your brain stops listening.
If the Tudors were the Kardashians of their time, this was their Kim. Henry VIII, the kingiest king who ever kinged over Britain.
If you had to draw a king, you'd definitely draw him, although maybe not as well as this, unless you're a 16th century portrait artist.
But what was so great about Henry VIII? Why is he the king we all still remember, unlike, say, Richard V? Well, for one thing, he was fat, so he takes up more room in the memory. But Henry's also memorable for his chronic wife addiction. He had 6 wives, all called Catherine.
He was a Catherineaholic, or Catholic for short.
He got through so many Catherines, he actually got bored of killing them and had to invent a new way of getting rid of them, called divorce.
The Pope hated divorce, so Henry decided to divorce him. He took back control, broke with Europe, and made up a new religion, which it turns out is easier to do than popes like to pretend. Henry created the Church of England, didn't he? Did he have to find a British pope?
He didn't need to find a British pope. You could just have bishops. You can just use the bishops and people that you've got in there already.
If you had to find a British pope now, who would you go for?
You couldn't use the Archbishop of Canterbury.
No, you have to have someone else.
Someone from without the church.
Yeah, like Matt Baker of The One Show.
So you're Matt Baker off The One Show.
He's not an obvious choice, you see. That's why I think he'd be good. But the more you think about it, the more it makes sense.
Henry VIII kept having a go on new wives because he wanted a boy to pop out of one of them, and eventually one did, called Edward. When Henry died, Edward became king, aged just 9 years old. Edward died aged 15, the youngest anyone had ever died of old age. He was followed as king by Lady Jane Grey. She ruled for 9 glorious days, almost a week. These were among the fastest royals we've ever had. After Jane came this woman, Queen Mary. And there really was something about Mary, but not something funny like Cameron Diaz with all dried spunk in her hair. Mary's something was religious intolerance. She had so many Protestants burnt at the stake, she became known as Bloody Mary, because like the drink, she was horrible.
The next queen was Queen Elizabeth, who in the first of many such coincidences appeared just in time for the Elizabethan era.
Queen Elizabeth I got a crown screwed on here in Westminster Abbey.
Elizabeth I was a new sort of king, in that she was a queen, which meant she got paid less and sat on horses sideways. To stop persecution, Elizabeth allowed her subjects to practice whatever religion they liked, as long as they pretended to be Church of England when asked, like middle-class people do when they want their kids to go to a posh school. During Elizabeth's reign, British culture flourished, especially the world of theatre, which is sadly still with us to this day.
The greatest playwright of the age was Will.I.am Shakespeare. It's often said if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be sending his scripts to television and film companies. It wouldn't make them because they were so long and boring.
But while audiences thrilled to the tedious drama of Shakespeare's terrible plays, some pioneering Britons were experiencing real drama by going out exploring.
It was now the British got really into boats, by getting into boats.
Sailors of the time were like spacemen, but on water, exploring the unknown armed only with an engineless wooden car called a boat, and a sort of basic paper sat-nav called a map, which had hardly anything on it, because hardly anything had been found yet.
On maps of the sea, do they show the hills? You know, the little moving hills with the white bit on top?
The waves?
Is that what they call the moving hills with the white bits on top?
I think that's what you mean.
Did an explorer ever try to sail into the sky? You know, find a bit of sea that's sort of going up and...
No.
Despite the difficulty, Queen Elizabeth sent a load of sailors over the sea to nick treasure off the Spanish, and then to nick whole countries off whichever brown people were standing on them at the time. The first British explorer to do this was Sir Walter Raleigh.
Sir Walter Raleigh was a great sailor, wasn't he? So why is it today we only remember him for his bikes?
Well, there might have been a connection between that branch of the Raleigh family and the later bike manufacturer, but I very much doubt it. People weren't using cycles of any kind in Sir Walter Raleigh's days.
Oh, really?
I think we really have to accept that Sir Walter Raleigh was just an expert sailor.
How did Sir Walter Raleigh invent the potato?
Well, he didn't invent the potato in that I don't think anyone actually has ever invented a root vegetable, because they're obviously being cultivated and used by people living in the Americas when he arrived there.
When Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, was he scared of them?
I think that when Sir Walter Raleigh first saw potatoes, not that we've any documented records on the moment when he first beheld a potato or a field of potatoes, but I don't think he was scared of them. This is a buccaneering character, and I think that he probably was able to take on and manage his emotions whilst engaging with potatoes at first sight.
We still celebrate potatoes to this day by buying and eating them. It's amazing to think that Queen Elizabeth was the first British monarch to be impressed by a baked potato, and the last.
Walter Raleigh was big news, but he wasn't quite as big news as Sir Francis Drake.
This is Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, which is Tudor for horse of gold. It was in this ship Drake became the first person to circumcise the globe, which is probably why this sort of ship is called a clipper. Imagine being on deck in that perilous age. You're in the middle of the ocean, a mighty thunderstorm's brewing. There's a sailor over there, another one over there, the king's sailor turning the steering wheel thing, potatoes and spare wooden legs. rolling around the deck. A seagull up that pole thing. Someone reading a treasure map through a telescope. A bloke with a white beard carrying a tray of fish fingers. Pirates, all laughing in that horrible throaty way that they do. And at any moment, the prospect that you might just sail off the edge of the world. It's a sobering thought, which they'd have needed because they were all pissed to the bollocks on rum. The British's mastery of the oceans made Catholic King Philip of Spain furious, in Spanish. So he sent his secret weapon to attack England, a woman called Spanish Amanda. The story goes that Drake was playing a leisurely game of bowls on Plymouth Hall when the Spanish attacked.
But Drake didn't let the Spanish attack put him off his stroke. He just carried on playing with his balls.
According to records, when he'd finished, Drake changed back into his normal shoes and thrashed the Spaniards. At war, not bowling. England was victorious. Meanwhile, in Scotland, there was another Mary on the scene, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary and Elizabeth were rivals for the throne. Catholics loved Mary because they go mad for anyone called Mary. So Elizabeth cut her head off, which made it harder for Mary to take the throne because she could no longer see where it was. Elizabeth had ended the rivalry. The final score was 1-0. Elizabeth died without ever marrying, so has gone down in history as the vegan queen. She left no heirs, which was the olden word for children, making her the season finale of the Tudors. The next top royal was King James, who luckily hadn't inherited his mum's missing head, and so could become King of Scotland and England at the same time.
King James I of England
Was also King James VI of Scotland, wasn't he?
He was.
Was he also the other 5 King Jameses in between?
No, but he was rather conscious of those other 5 Jameses.
Do you think he ever forgot which James he was?
No, I'm pretty sure that he knew there'd been all 5 before him and they'd had rotten lives.
Oh.
The first had been murdered by his subjects, the second killed by an exploding cannon. The third was murdered by his subjects after losing a battle. The fourth was killed in battle. And the fifth died of nervous exhaustion after losing a battle.
So is it just bad luck being called James then, do you think?
No, the Stuarts are an astonishingly accident-prone family.
King James brought England, Scotland and Wales together, didn't he?
King James brought England, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall and Ireland together.
So he brought all those together?
That's right.
Like Simon Cowell when he brought together One Direction?
Yes, except it lasted a bit longer.
Which is your favourite?
Of the kingdoms?
No, of One Direction.
I don't have one.
Yeah, very wise. Thanks to King James, Great Britain was born, and with it came a new flag, the Union Jack, a sort of mega mix of the nation's previous flags. The Union Jack has it all. The white and red of England, the blue of Scotland, and from Wales, red again, from the dragon. But not the actual dragon, even though it's the best bit of the flag. Basically, whoever was doing this probably just had a ruler and couldn't face doing the dragon. King James was Protestant and knew that Catholics wanted to kill him, so he had all his clothes padded in case he was stabbed. Unfortunately, he didn't have the Houses of Parliament padded, and that's where the Catholics chose to attack, using explosions. This photo from the time shows the gunpowder plotters in the hats and false beards they used to hide their identities. What they didn't know is that someone had written their names on the wall behind, which is why they all got caught. But one man was about to cause even more explosive changes to Britain, Oliver Cromwell. Some of Cromwell's fellow Puritans had sailed away from Britain's shores, hoping to forge a new life of Spartan misery in the newfound land of America. But Cromwell stayed behind to fall out with King Charles I. He wanted Parliament dissolved, but nobody could find a glass big enough, so they decided to have a civil war instead.
They called it a civil war because there was a swear jar and people apologised after killing each other, like in tennis. The Civil War was a clash of styles. The King's Cavaliers had panache and weird outfits, while Cromwell's Roundheads were basic, brutish little bulldog men. It was like a fight between Wayne Rooney and Noel Fielding, but not as funny.
Eventually, after many reenactments just like this, the Roundheads won 1-0. Charles was caught in a big king net and executed here in Whitehall. A proud man to the last, he wore 2 shirts so no one could see him shiver, to preserve his regal dignity. And according to witnesses, it worked. His severed head rolled regally along the ground, pumping blood everywhere and getting covered in hay and dirt and dried up flecks of dignified fox shit. And no one mentioned the rest of him shivering at all. Under Cromwell, Britain became less fun than ever before, including when it was just rocks. As a Puritan, Cromwell outlawed popular entertainment, effectively turning the entire country into BBC 4. Little wonder that after Cromwell died, everyone decided it would be fun having a king once more. Charles II came down from the tree he'd been hiding in, and everyone was happy again, until suddenly in 1665 the plague happened. Again. Why did they decide to have the plague twice? More than anything, it must have just been boring.
Well, they had many, many more times than twice.
Did we get the plague because of the European free movement of rats and fleas and our inability to control our borders?
It certainly looks as though the epidemic came to England by ship.
Mm.
So in that sense, yes, it's imported. They are immigrant rats and fleas.
And they wouldn't integrate, except when they bit us. The Great Plague of London finally petered out in 1666, just in time for the Great Fire of London, which started here in Pudding Lane. It was a hot, dry summer when a thatched wooden bakery full of highly combustible flour and flaming ovens inexplicably caught fire for some reason. How hot was the Great Fire of London? Could you stand in somewhere like Maidenhead and sort of warm your hands on it like that?
You couldn't warm your hands, but you probably could see it.
How many other cities did the Great Fire of London burn down?
No other cities. It was the Great Fire of London, but lots of other places were affected.
But how do we know no other cities burnt down? Because it would have burnt them down.
Yes, but we know that London was burnt, even though it was burnt down. So we would have the same sorts of information about other places that didn't burn down.
But there might have been another place burnt down that just burnt down completely, and now we don't know because it's not there because it was burnt down.
But then that wouldn't be part of the Great Fire of London, would it?
No, it'd be outside, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So were there any others that burnt down?
There don't seem to have been any other fires at the same time.
Although we don't know because they burnt down.
Well, that's one way of looking at it.
We know a lot about the plague and the fire of London from the diaries of this man, Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys is probably the most famous diarist in the world, apart from Anne Frank, but no one knows what happened to her. We do know what happened to Pepys because he put it in his diary. Pepys was brave, wasn't he, writing his diary at the time of the Great Fire of London. You know, all that paper. He risked his life for us, really, didn't he?
I don't think he risked his life for us. It was for himself.
If Pepys was alive today, do you think he'd be doing Snapchat? And it's best to say yes, because we're trying to attract younger viewers.
Yes, I'm sure he would be.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah. After the fire was blown out by the king, London was extensively rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren, the most significant bird in British history since Francis Drake.
This is his finest achievement, St Paul's Cathedral, built on a site of spiritual significance near the Sainsbury's local and the restaurant where they do first dates.
As well as being big, the cathedral was the first building in the world with a hat. It would get 10 out of 10 in Cathedral Review Monthly, if that magazine existed, which it doesn't. Meanwhile, London wasn't the only thing that was being burned. Witches were too. People genuinely believed witches were amongst them, their fear fueled by leaked photos like this. There wasn't a clear-cut way of telling whether someone was a witch if they weren't wearing their pointy hat. So Britain appointed its first and only Witchfinder General. Who was the Witchfinder General?
The Witchfinder General was a young man called Matthew Hopkins.
Matthew Hopkins? He went to my school.
This is a different Matthew Hopkins, I hope.
How do you know? He's an IT consultant now.
Well, the Matthew Hopkins I'm talking about died 350 years ago. He went on a witch hunt which covered the whole of East Anglia and resulted in the death of about 100 women.
Yeah, it's not the same Matthew Hopkins.
No.
My Matthew Hopkins is going through a divorce.
Well, I think that's pretty harrowing, but compared with stringing up aged women upon scaffolds and torturing them into confession, it's probably fairly minor.
Yeah, puts everything in perspective, doesn't it?
That's the great thing about history.
Mm. Matthew Hopkins devised a method to test if a woman was a witch. Hopkins' method was absolutely foolproof, which was handy because it had to be done by village idiots. The accused woman was lowered into water. If they floated, they were a witch and were killed. If they drowned, they were innocent and could go on living a normal life underwater for 2 to 3 seconds. But the irrational world of witches and wizards was about to be blown away by the rational world of science and geniuses like Sir Isaac Newton. In 1665, Newton ran away from London because the plague was after him, so he came here, to Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, a National Trust property that he was allowed to live in because he was famous. The story goes that an apple fell from this tree and landed on Newton's head. Despite his amazing hair, the force of the fruity blow caused several of his brain cells to rub together, and just like that, he invented gravity.
What was the world like before Isaac Newton discovered gravity? Was everything just floating up to the sky?
Well, gravity was always there, so it
But
just
he just took the credit for it.
Because he had come up with laws of motion and things like that, gravity was a major part of his understanding of the world.
If gravity's real, as you seem to be claiming, how come it doesn't work on kites?
In all things, there's a balance of forces, and so a kite stays in the air because of forces that are keeping the kite in the air.
Would you say the best example of gravity today is the game show Tipping Point? Because without gravity, that wouldn't work, would it?
For sure. But I wouldn't say it's the best example of gravity. There's way more exciting examples than that.
Go on, tell me.
Well, there's flight, and there's walking on the moon. There
I
is
thought you
less
meant what's the best game show version of gravity?
Oh.
Deal or no deal?
It doesn't really use gravity.
Well, I thought you said everything uses gravity. Because Noel Edmonds would be up in the roof otherwise, wouldn't he?
That's true. We're all subject to gravity without realising it, but the game would still go on, even without gravity. Or maybe not, actually.
I've thrown you now, haven't I?
You have.
Made you think.
But gravity had a dark side. While everyone in Britain was busy thinking about why things fall, across the Atlantic, an entire nation was about to tumble, just like an apple, onto Britain's head. On the 4th of July 1776, America officially declared a war of independence from the British. It was a brutal conflict, with the British eventually suffering a humiliating defeat a mere 210 years before the premiere of the BBC sitcom Brushstrokes.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
Losing America was a real knee in the balls for Britain. But fortunately for national pride, one great British hero was about to rise. Vice Admiral Viscount Lord Horatio Nelson.
What was Lord Nelson all about? Why did his parents call him Horatio?
I think they probably intended it to be pronounced Horatio.
But it just got mishmashed up and became Horatio.
No, I think that most people still know him as Horatio Nelson.
As well as being a sailor, Nelson found time to star in lots of old paintings, doing his weird signature pose.
Why did Nelson always have one hand up his jumper? What was he doing up there?
He'd lost most of his right arm, so it wasn't really trying to conceal his hand. He was actually missing an arm.
Oh, God. How do we know that that's true, though? Because, you know, Rod Hull, he used to have his arm round an emu, didn't he? It might have just been that. He didn't have it blown off at all. He was just trying to make his story more interesting.
Well, I don't see why I'd bother to do that. I mean, he's already a heroic figure, so I don't think he needed to sort of feign, you know, serious injury to, if you like, deepen his growing legend. So I think we can probably say that, unlike some things, this is true.
Yeah, and the eye was true.
The eye was true as well, yes. He wore a patch.
So he was like a pirate, but like a boring one.
Not being able to clap wasn't the most annoying thing in Nelson's life. He had an arch enemy, the annoyingly similar French pirate Napoleon Cumberbatch. The fearsome French emperor had conquered most of Europe and was on the verge of having a conquer at Britain. But before he could, he had to have a Battle of Trafalgar against Nelson.
The Battle of Trafalgar was one of the most famous water fights in British history, and it took place, of course, here in Trafalgar Square. It's amazing to think that back then, all this would have been underwater. Only the top of the column would have been visible. On this side, Nelson's English ships. On this side, by the Pret-a-Manger, the French fleet. And overseeing it all was Nelson, stranded on top of his stone stick, where he remains to this day.
If Nelson was such a hero, why did we banish him up that big pole?
It's not a banishment, this was a national celebration. So this was very much, if you like, a symbol of British victory and pride and honouring of the man who had been so intimately associated with delivering victory at Trafalgar.
He's so high up, isn't he? He's sort of out of eyeshot. And he's getting shat on by birds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a...
Couldn't we have had him a little bit lower so that we can have a look at him?
Well, it's a fair point, I mean...
It's just like a joke.
Yeah.
Nelson's great victory at Trafalgar was sadly spoiled for him when he was shot by a French sniper. Taken below decks, he was comforted by his naval colleague Hardy, who kissed him to death. If Hardy was kissing Nelson at the exact moment he was dying, to what extent would that make him a necrophile? Because that's a serious offence.
It took him 3 or 4 hours to die, and this particular famous moment took place when Nelson was still very much alive.
So there was nothing dodgy about it?
Nothing dodgy at all.
Nelson may have died, but a whole new chapter of British history was about to be born. And it was all thanks to one woman, Queen Victorian era. But that's a story for another time and place. Next week, and here. Next time, I'll be looking at the 19th century and asking the big questions. Who was Albert Hall? Why did Oliver twist? And what are Wordsworth? Wordsworth wrote, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." But clouds don't have legs, do they? No. So how was he allowed to get away with that kind of stuff?
From Radio 1, follow the world's most ridiculous investigator, leaving no stone unturned. Listen on iPlayer Radio. And what happens when Lemmy spends the day at home with his camera? Watch his homemade show now on BBC iPlayer.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back, what actually is it? Who are we, and why?
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country. On my odyssey, I'll be starting sentences in one location
and finishing them in another.
And looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them. If Shelley's one of the greatest poets in English literature, how come nobody gives a shit about him today?
That's a complicated question.
But it's not just a story of things. It's also a story of people sitting or standing on things. All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
Last time, we saw how the British leaked out of Britain itself and sailed the world in boats.
This week, we're examining the 19th century.
This was a time of invention, industry, discovery, empire building, urban squalor, sexual hypocrisy, optimism, statues, painting, photograph, him, her, them and tree. It was a time when British creativity was at its peak, bringing us everything from great works of art to great works of train. A time when Britain very much entered the third episode of its history. It's the early 19th century, and Britain is in the grip of the Georgian era, a time when all English kings had to be called George. There was George III, George II, George IV and George I, though not necessarily in that order. The Georgian era saw the birth of a new artistic movement, the Romantics. They weren't like the old Romantics, which is like when your dad buys your mum a box of black magic from the service station when it isn't even her birthday. And they weren't like the new Romantics, which were all synthesizers and wind machines. Instead, they were poets and artists whose names are still familiar today. Wordsworth, Shelley, Blake, and the other ones. To find out more, I went to speak to an expert. Who was Ron?
Among the Romantics, you mean?
Yeah.
William Godwin was quite wrong. He believed that there should be no laws at all in society.
No, who's Ron?
Ron? Is there a Ron?
Yeah, the one that wrote all the poems and signed them by Ron.
Yeah, that was his family name, Byron. Lord George Byron.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Who was the man from Nantucket that Byron wrote about in his poem?
I don't remember that poem.
It's the one that goes, there was a young man from Nantucket.
Is that Byron?
I think so, it was really good.
How did it end?
Byron was like a rock star. He was sexy like Mick Jagger, brooding like Kurt Cobain, and he had brown hair like Harry Styles. Little wonder he's still considered the #1 dead romantic in history. Which was your favourite of the Romantics?
Probably Byron, I would think. Byron was the bad boy of the Romantic poets. It's thought that he probably slept with his sister and with most other women in England.
He was your favourite?
Yeah.
The one who slept with his sister?
Well, it's not on that basis that I like him. I was just giving you a bit of background on him.
Would that have shocked people, or was everyone sleeping with a sister back then?
I think it was. I mean, he spent much of his life in exile, and
Where's exile?
Well, in his case, it was in Italy mainly. And he wrote Don Juan, which is one of the greatest pieces of particularly rhyming poetry in English literature.
It must be a good book if you can overlook the fact he slept with his sister. But not all women of the age were Byron's sister who he was sleeping with. Some of them were other women, like this one. What exactly was Jane Austen?
Jane Austen was a woman from Hampshire who wrote novels.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it, absolutely.
Austen wrote novels, which are books, which look like this on the outside and this on the inside, filled with words it's almost impossible to care about. When are they going to translate Jane Austen's books into proper English? You know, from like ancient English? Because they're sort of hard to concentrate on, aren't they, now that we've got like phones and stuff?
Well, she's not that hard, really. The sentences have sometimes got some nice balancing clauses with a lot of humour in them.
Why do they keep making Jane Austen's books into films and TV shows? There's only about 5 of them, isn't there? Whereas, like, there's 50 Mr. Men books, and they haven't done all of those yet.
I think there are lots of reasons for that. People love the love stories. They like the costumes. They're also wonderful books with lots of opportunities for humour.
Are we talking about Jane Austen or Mr. Men?
Probably both.
Yeah. Who's your favourite Mr. Man?
Mr. Tickle, probably.
Yeah, love Mr. Tickle. Jane Austen died in 1817, only to be reincarnated 200 years later in the form of this banknote. But important though she wasn't the most significant woman of the century. That honour belonged to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is often portrayed as old and grumpy. It's where the term Victoria Cross comes from. But she wasn't always a sour, disapproving old woman. She was once a sour, disapproving baby. Queen Victoria was born in 1819, in the usual way, out of a woman. It was hard to tell that this infant would grow up to be queen because her crown hadn't yet formed. It was just hair, which must have been a relief to her mother as she was pushing her out. As well as looking miserable, her other hobby was fashion. Even at an early age, she was dressing like a cross between a disillusioned Lord Mayor and an angry hen. In 1837, aged 18, Victoria became queen. Her reign was to be a period of great industrial, cultural, scientific and political change. But the main thing people asked her about was why she was still single and when she was getting married. Eventually, to shut everyone up, she fell in love with her cousin Albert. Prince Albert was German, but Victoria was willing to overlook that because they were in love, and because most of her family were German too. Their untrammelled sexual passion is evident in every photograph of them. What no one saw coming was that during Victoria's reign, Britain would be turned upside down by an avalanche of hurricane proportions called progress. This was the Industrial Revolution. And the very first winds of that changequake detonated in the almost prehistoric world of transport. The Victorians had horse-drawn buses, but you never see horses drawing anything these days, do you? When did they lose the ability to draw? Is it when their hands sort of turned into hooves?
When we talk about horse-drawn buses, we're not really talking about horses drawing buses, but pulling them along. So that's the meaning of the word draw in this instance.
Right.
And that stopped really once we had the railways and then even more the engines.
Engines ran on a mysterious new element the Victorians had discovered called steam.
It was a big deal, wasn't it, when they got trains to run on steam? Where did they get the steam that powered the trains back then? Did they have to sort of mine it from underground, or did they get it from the sky?
Well, you can actually make steam by boiling water. So what they're doing is using the coal to boil the water and make the steam that way.
Right, so clouds are made of boiling water. Why don't planes boil then when we fly through them?
I think you probably want to speak to a meteorologist about the clouds.
Okay.
As well as carrying steam, trains could move people huge distances, and they work much harder and faster than horses. And unlike horses, they've got a big smiley face on the front and the voice of Ringo Starr.
Soon the inevitable happened, and mankind bred with trains, creating half-human, half-trained super-engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who kicked the Industrial Revolution into overdrive. Why is Brunel considered one of the greatest Britons of all time?
Brunel built so many different things, towns, canals, bridges. I mean, he was responsible for many of the things that happened during the Industrial Revolution. He really took our country forward in terms of technological progress.
Where does he rank compared to, say, Nick Knowles?
He's definitely further up the list, on my list.
Nick Knowles or Brunel?
Brunel.
I suppose we haven't given Nick Knowles a proper chance yet, have we? We don't know what he might come up with yet. This is one of Brunel's most famous achievements, the Clifton Suspension Bridge, Britain's first white-knuckle ride. Although disappointingly flat compared to today's roller coasters, millions still flock to Bristol every year just to queue up and have a go on it. As well as bridges and tunnels, the Industrial Revolution brought factories. Factories were cavernous holes of noise and machinery, dirty and dangerous environments without even basic Wi-Fi and only the most rudimentary breakout spaces. But they were changing Britain forever. These days, no one works in these factories except ghosts, and even then, they only work night shifts. Workers did long, thankless hours with no breaks and low pay in a squalid and threatening environment, conditions unthinkable today to anyone who isn't a junior doctor. The Industrial Revolution was so frenetic, a man called Charles Babbage got carried away and invented the computer far too early. Modern computers are tiny, but this was as big as a transit van. It was even bigger than the 1990s one your dad's got in the loft and won't throw away in case the bin men find all his bank details and mucky JPEGs. Hello, who are you?
I'm Doran Swade. I'm an historian of computing, and I was responsible for building this engine.
So what games does it have?
It doesn't have any games.
It must have like some basic games like Mario Kart or Snake or
I'm afraid
or
not.
Patience, like the shittest one. It must have Patience.
I'm afraid it doesn't.
It doesn't have any games.
None whatever. It just does mathematical calculation.
So where's the screen on this computer?
A screen, again, is part of the electronic era. This has no screens. As it happens, you don't need to read the numbers because it prints them automatically for you.
It's a shame, isn't it, that it doesn't have a screen, because then you could turn it upside down and the numbers would become rude words. You know, like with a calculator.
Yes.
Have you ever done that?
I haven't, but I know what you mean.
You've done this, but you haven't done that.
Correct.
Babbage never foresaw the terrible consequences of his invention, a machine that would autocorrect his name to Cabbage every single time. The Victorian age was an era of huge and inventive leaps. But one man was about to take too large a step for many: Charles Darwin. Darwin was born the son of a doctor, but using his own theories soon evolved into a scientist. He was fascinated by nature and decided to find out more about it by going to sea on a beagle. Darwin sailed off on his science mission on a beagle, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He went off for 5 years on the Beagle, a
Yeah.
small ship which
It was a ship.
circumnavigated the world.
Not
yeah.
a dog.
No,
So it wasn't a ship that evolved into a dog.
certainly not, no.
On his journey, he visited the Noel Gallagher's Islands and came up with a theory that animals that were dead were less likely to reproduce than ones that were alive. Talk me through the events that led up to the moment where Charles Darwin invented the monkey.
Darwin didn't invent the monkey. No one invented a monkey.
Okay, well, talk me through the events that led up to the moment where Charles Darwin didn't invent the monkey.
Charles Darwin saw monkeys as potential progenitors of humans, i.e. we could have evolved from them.
When they put monkeys in zoos, how long does it take for them to turn human?
Well, it's not really to do with the zoo.
All right, so say we kept one in the wild. How long would it take for that monkey to grow like a nose or ears?
Well, they have noses and ears that are perfectly functional.
Like a man's nose?
Those apes and monkeys don't need a human nose. It wouldn't do them any good.
What's the fastest evolution could happen? Like, how fast could you turn a pig into a cow?
A pig into a cow? You're never going to be able to turn a pig into a cow. Why would you want to turn a pig into a cow? Pigs are quite good at being pigs, and cows are relatively good at being cows. Why do you want to turn a pig into a cow?
Just see what it's like. In 1859, he wrote a book about his theory called The Oranges of the Peaches, which described how oranges have evolved from peaches. Controversially, the book claimed that man was descended from monkeys, a twist most of the readers were unprepared for. The idea that man and ape were close relatives was considered both hilarious and shocking, a bit like Graham Norton, but with more profound consequences for all humankind. Eventually, Darwin evolved himself into a corpse. He was buried here in Westminster Abbey before evolving again into worms and dust. Meanwhile, Britain itself was evolving into an empire. The British Empire was the biggest the world had ever seen. It had started back in the days of Drake and Raleigh, then expanded when Captain Cook discovered Australia, when he took the first ever gap year working on a beach near Sydney. With its year-round sunshine and abundant food, Australia was deemed the perfect place to send Britain's murderers. It was hoped they'd suffer terrible homesickness as they lay soaking up the sun.
But there was a dark side to Britain's ever-increasing globalisation: slavery. These days, people pay thousands of pounds to visit the sun-kissed islands of the Caribbean. But in the 1700s, you could go there for free if you were black and didn't want to go there.
It was immediately obvious to anyone that slavery was wrong, which is why it was only allowed to continue for hundreds of years. There were many countries in the British Empire. By Victoria's day, the empire bits were coloured pink on the map, to remind white Britons what colour they'd turn if they went there and stood in the sun too long. And no bit of the map was pinker than the jewel in the crown, India. For years, a British business, the East India Company, had ruled over India, and the locals weren't happy. A corporation running a country is the sort of thing that usually happens in a scary science fiction film, but this was real and ages ago and had all tea leaves in it instead of lasers. After a people's rebellion, the company was replaced in 1858 by the British monarchy and the British Raj was born. Queen Victoria was made Empress of India in 1877, a title she was so thrilled by she immediately set about never visiting the Indian continent at any point in her life. For some reason, the debate still rages as to how good the British Empire actually was. Was the British Empire evil like it was in Star Wars?
I think the important point here is that, yes, many people would have seen the British Empire as being an evil empire, whilst at the same time many people, unsurprisingly most of them British, would have seen it as something that was a beacon of light. So I think that here lies one of the key debates in British imperial history: was it good or was it bad?
Who was the Darth Vader of the Empire? Was it Queen Victoria?
You probably wouldn't have had anyone quite as powerful as Darth Vader, as, if you like, a supreme leader.
What about Luke Skywalker?
I think many people would have liked to have undertaken a Skywalker-like role as a saviour, but there probably weren't too many of those around.
Chewbacca?
No, I think that's stretching it.
Meanwhile, back home, with machines doing all the hard work, people had more free time on their hands than ever, and they needed entertaining. What sort of music was popular in Victorian times? What were the genres? R&B, soul, rock?
One was the music hall.
Is music hall the first sort of music named after a building? And do you think that was a big influence on acid house? Despite the name, music hall wasn't just music in a hall. As well as singers, there were comedians, dancers and variety turns, like on Britain's Got Talent, but with a few differences. Back then, audiences enjoyed the acts for themselves, rather than asking David Williams or Amanda Holden to do it for them. And because the only way to change channel in Victorian times was to walk up the road to a different music hall, the acts could be a lot shitter. So could you play some music hall for me now?
Right, well, there were lots of popular songs, and they liked certain sort of rhythms and vamps. So this was a very popular one, which would go like this. My old man said, follow the line, and don't dilly-dally on the way. That sort of rhythm was very popular.
So why was that considered entertaining? But while commoners enjoyed this Victorian equivalent of ITV, posh folk were getting into a primitive paper-based form of television called books, which streamed content from the page into your mind's eye. Books were being produced in huge numbers. Perhaps that's why the Victorian era produced more Victorian writers than any other period in history. This is one of them, Sir Arthur Conan Roddy Doyle, perhaps the greatest writer of detective fiction he could possibly be, the inventor of Sherlock Holmes. The first Sherlock Holmes story was such a hit, Conan Doyle wrote 55 sequels, which is 4 more than The Fast and the Furious. Although in the Sherlock Holmes stories, some stuff happens that isn't skidding. Since his Victorian origins, Sherlock Holmes himself has regenerated many times and in many different forms throughout history, from drawings to black and white man, to a black and white man in colour, into a cricketer, and even an alien. But perhaps the best known Victorian to put quill to paper is one of the greatest writers Britain has ever shut out, Sir Charles Dickens.
Dickens lived here in a house, but he left when the council turned it into a museum, gift shop and education centre in his memory.
He became a writer and began to create some of the most time-consuming stories in history. The names of Dickens' most famous works are still familiar today: Nicholas Nickelback, Great Defecations, David's Copperfield, The Picnic Papers, and his masterpiece, Oliver's Twist. Despite the spoiler in its title, Oliver's Twist doesn't have a twist at the end, which, come to think of it, is a brilliant twist in itself. That's how clever Dickens was. Like many of Dickens' works, Oliver's Twist exposed the grim underbelly of Victorian London. As you can see from this blistering adaptation, it's an uncompromising, searing vision of extreme poverty and synchronised dancing. Despite his genius, Dickens' immortality couldn't last, and in 1870 he died forever. We don't know what his last words were, or whether he managed to blurt out "the end" just before closing his mouth for the last time. But while Dickens was celebrated, another Victorian wordsmith found himself on the wrong side of the law. Oscar Wilde was a brilliant writer and wit, which is the Victorian word for top bants merchant. He was persecuted for being gay and ended up in reading jail. Luckily, being a literary man, he loved reading and was so happy he wrote a song about it. Sadly, it didn't do very well because there's no tune to speak of, and as you can see, he's misspelt jail on the front. The Victorians treated Wilde like a sexual deviant because they were extremely prudish. In polite society, clothing was prim and proper. Even glimpsing an ankle was considered racy. So chances are anyone seeing a bum would have had a stroke. In fact, the famed Victorian morality was nothing more than a hypocritical front. For one thing, as these photographs prove, people still had buttocks and muffs. Some people even had intercourse. Victorian London in particular was a hotbed of vice, with many a so-called respectable gentleman paying women for sex up the East End. If you were a prostitute in London in 1888, there were two words guaranteed to put the fear of God into you: Jack and the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was one of the most antisocial murderers Britain has ever seen. Much of the fear of the Ripper was stirred up by the press and by the way he kept killing people. The murders brought shame on 19th century London, which is why, unlike other prominent Victorians of the age, Jack the Ripper has never appeared on a banknote. Despite this, he's just as popular today as he wasn't back then. You can still go on Ripper tours around Whitechapel, a fun way of commemorating a serial killer, although committing murders on the tour itself is likely discouraged. Because the culprit himself was never caught, there's a lot we still don't know about Jack the Ripper. We don't know who he was or why he did it. We don't even know if Jack the Ripper was his real name or just a nickname like 50 Cent. We don't know when he died or if he died. It's chilling to think that Jack the Ripper could still be alive today, living somewhere out there under his real name. Maybe he's one of your friends or neighbours, or maybe he's you. You'd have no way of knowing, and that's terrifying. But it wasn't just prostitutes who died in Victorian Britain. So did Victoria's beloved husband Albert, who succumbed to typhoid and stomach and bum trouble in 1861, a mere 125 years before the first transmission of the BBC comedy series Brushstrokes.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
Victoria was so heartbroken by Albert's death, she spent the rest of her life wearing black and pulling a face like Alfred Hitchcock watching a dog drown. The grieving Queen commissioned monuments to Albert's memory, such as the Prince Albert Memorial and the Royal Albert Hall, which functioned as both a concert hall and a receptacle for Adolf Hitler's missing bollock. And then Victoria did what any widow would and went off to the Isle of Wight to look out of the window until she died. Fittingly, for a monarch whose reign had seen many technological advancements, moving pictures had just been invented, just in time to capture her funeral. But sadly, not in time for her to enjoy the footage of her funeral. The entire country came to a standstill for the procession. It was as though the British public weren't just burying a queen, but an entire era, which they'd somehow managed to fit in the box along with her body. The death of Queen Victoria reduced the number of women with a voice in British politics by 100%, because in 1901, women did not have the vote, even though at the time, half the men in Britain were women. Women were thought of as simple creatures who could give birth and raise families, but couldn't be trusted with something as complicated as drawing an X with a pencil.
Today it's unthinkable that a woman wouldn't be able to vote unless she was really hungover or in her slippers and it was raining. But back then it was the law. One woman decided that had to change.
Emmerdale Pankhurst thought women could be more than just wives and mothers, so she deliberately only had 5 children, leaving her loads of time for politics.
She founded the suffragette movement. These women were tough and prepared to fight, like Wonder Woman, but with sleeves.
The suffragettes protested in creative ways. Some chained themselves to important buildings rather than the kitchen sink. Others went on hunger strike, kick-starting the food detox craze that continues to this day. One suffragette, Emily Davison, threw herself under a horse to get the vote, but the vote wasn't under a horse.
It was in a little wooden booth in a primary school, but to be fair, women wouldn't have known that.
The suffragettes wanted the vote so badly, they were prepared to die for it. Nobody knows why.
Maybe they imagined it was better in here than it actually is. Maybe they thought there'd be games or sandwiches in here. If they'd known it was just a pencil on a shoelace, they might not have bothered.
Eventually, women did get the vote after the next bit of history, but I can't skip past the next bit because the next bit is war, and men will find that interesting. Next time, we move into the early 20th century, a period when TV was invented, making life actually worth living for the first time, and also a time when Britain fought 2 world wars, but no World Cups.
Why were all the British soldiers in World War I called Tommy? Was that just a coincidence?
Rather than adventures in history, you can enjoy the misadventures of BBC Three's Young Offenders on iPlayer now. And you can listen to comedy from Radio 1 on iPlayer Radio, with Ray Moss, a podcast detective who leaves no stone unturned.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back, what actually is it? Who are we, and why?
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country. From the White Cliffs of Dover to the Scottish Highlands of the Scottish Highlands. From old stone circles to modern stone circles.
From the tranquil beauty of Roman Bath to the golden wonder of Oxford services. I'll discover how we went from ancient man to Ed Sheeran, why Elizabeth I happened, and solving the mystery of just who Winston Churchill was, and why he wound up helplessly trapped inside this banknote. Along the way, I'll be shouting at helicopters!
And looking at some of the biggest events in British history and asking people about them. In War II, why did the British build bombers to attack their own territory?
How do you mean?
Well, the Lancaster bombers. And also, walking somewhere impressive with my mouth shut, while my voice speaks anyway, like I'm talking aloud in my own head. All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
In the last episode, we saw how Britain was invaded by the Victorians, who fought and won the Industrial Revolution, but not without losing their leader, Queen Victoria, who stopped happening just as the 20th century began. Now, as well as a new century, Britain had a new monarch, King Edward, who, despite his name, wasn't a potato, but a man. Edward's coronation was a grand affair, celebrated with a song that was to become Britain's unofficial theme tune, Land of Open Glory. This melodic musical tune was written by one of the best British composers this side of Ed Sheeran, Elgar. Who was Elgar? He sounds sort of rough. Was he a caveman or something?
No, Elgar was a composer in the late 19th century.
When someone like Elgar's invented a new tune, how did they sort of convert it into orchestra mode, so it's being played by instruments?
He probably, when he composed it and notated it out and had the sound in his head, he would then what's called orchestrate it. So he'd write out all the parts for all the different instruments, and then he'd hand that over to an orchestra and they would play it.
How do the instruments know what to play, though?
Because it was all written out for them. Their little part was written out for them, and all the little parts joined together.
So the instruments have people attached to them?
They do.
So what's Land of Hope and Glory all about? What's its core message?
Well, it's a patriotic song. People think it's about bashing the drum for Britain, really.
If you sang it in, like, Portuguese, would it still feel British, or would that just fucking ruin it?
Well, it wouldn't have any meaning, but you might get that it sounded like it was supposed to stir you up without knowing why or what it was about.
So it's sort of like Three Lions, isn't it, by the Lightning Seeds with Frank Skinner and David Baddiel?
It is.
But less catchy. Sadly, no amount of patriotic music could save the new monarch from an early death. And in 1910, King Edward died and was buried beneath the soil to rule over his fellow potatoes for all eternity. Little did he know it at the time, but he'd narrowly avoided tragedy by dying, because just a few years later, in 1914, Britain suffered the first of many 20th century shocks. Nowadays, first world is something you put in front of the word problem to show that it isn't really that bad, like running out of couscous or not being able to check Twitter in a tunnel. But back then, first world was what they called the war. The First World War had loads of nicknames: the War to End All Wars, the Great War, and of course, World War I. Why did they call World War I World War I? It's quite pessimistic numbering, isn't it? Or did they just know it was the start of a franchise?
At the time, they weren't numbering the wars, although I think that in the First World War, the idea of it being a great war, denoting the sheer scale of the conflict, the casualty rate, was already becoming used quite a lot.
So it was called the Great War, but not because it was great. The First World War was started by the killing of one man, Franz Ferdinand. You've probably never heard of him, or the band named after him, but he was dead important, by which I mean he was only important when he was dead. His assassination triggered a series of other killings. Soon it caught on, and everyone wanted to be killed. It was a bigger craze than fidget spinners. Eventually, Britain got sucked into the fighting, and men queued up to have their flat caps converted into fighting men's helmets. Soon, hundreds of thousands of Tommies were heading for battle. Why were all the British soldiers in World War I called Tommy? Was that just a coincidence?
No, it wasn't a coincidence. It's just a general name that became applied to British soldiers in the same way we talk of Fritz as being a generic name for German soldiers.
What happened in Norman's land? Were only people that were called Norman allowed in there?
Well, it's not Norman's land, this is no man's land. And the idea being that this is particularly dangerous territory between the lines of the Germans on one side and the British on the other. This is essentially just a killing zone, a very dangerous zone in between trench systems.
Why did they fire shells at each other? Because shells wouldn't really hurt, would they? Unless they were those razor clam shells, because they're quite sharp, aren't they?
Well, these weren't seashells, these were heavy pieces of ordnance. We're actually talking about bits of metal in brass casing, so that's where the name shells comes from.
All right. Looking at footage from the time, it's hard to get a grip on just how brutal it must have been for Tommy and Norman, because it's in black and white and everyone's moving too fast, probably to avoid the shells. Even though it looks a bit like Charlie Chaplin, it's actually not funny at all, so you can't laugh, just like with Charlie Chaplin. One man who vividly captured the sheer horror of War I was the poet Wilfred Owen.
If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. Obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues.
You get the gist.
My friend.
As if the killing wasn't bad enough, the accommodation was scarcely worth 2 stars on TripAdvisor. Soldiers had to live in trenches, snaking cramped corridors of filth and squalor, without so much as a patio. The World War I trenches weren't the right place for conventional warfare, were they? But why did neither side think about mud wrestling? Because they're the perfect conditions, aren't they?
Well, I mean, trench warfare wasn't new. I think that whilst you will get the occasional game of Christmas football, I don't think that anyone actually ever thought that letting the guns fall silent and having mud wrestling competitions was ever going to sort anything out.
I think they missed a trick, don't you? Eventually the war ended at 11 o'clock on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in the year 1119, 1118, hence the term stopping for 11s. The soldiers came home to a Britain they could hardly recognise because it was wearing a skirt. While the Tommies had been away at the front, women had stepped into their old jobs. There were women milkmen, women postmen, women bus driver men, even women male prostitutes. What's more, the economy was in a pickle. After the war, many industries found it almost impossible to sell their goods abroad because abroad was mainly rubble. There were strikes and marches and a Great Depression. Things were shithouse bad. People needed escapism, but luckily for them, the age of mass entertainment was just beginning. It was the roaring 20s. City streets were full of jazz clubs, packed with Jeeveses and Worcesters, and women with Lego haircuts dancing like they were surprised while shitting their pants at a fancy dress party. And people who couldn't afford to enjoy a roaring 20s for themselves could still watch films of other people doing it at the newly invented cinema. The cinema was a cross between YouTube and theatre. Despite this, it was popular and people queued to get in. They showed Charlie Chaplin films, but even that couldn't keep them away. The whole country went films bonkers. Going to the cinema in those days was more like going to a book because there was no sound. The story was explained by words on the screen, a bit like spoilers, but happening at the same time as you were watching it, so not as annoying. And if you couldn't make it to a cinema or cocktail bar, you could still enjoy the jazz age because scientists had worked out a way to force jazz into your house using a magic called radio. Radio was an exciting new invention that made it possible to hear other people's voices in your living room without the use of thin walls or a devastating mental condition. To help keep the early airwaves in check, the government created something called the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC. How come the BBC started with radio? Because radio's loads less popular than television, isn't it?
There are people in radio who'd get very angry about that. Radio still performs tremendously well.
There's still radio.
There is still radio. At the time the BBC was set up, there wasn't a choice because there was no TV.
Luckily, a man called John Logie Baird was about to give birth to television. Not literally out of his vagina, but metaphorically out of his shed. After doing some weird experiments like something out of Wallace and Gromit, Baird's TV was finalised, although idiotically, he'd gone to the trouble of inventing it without checking whether there were any programmes on yet. It took a while before there was anything worth putting your iPhone down for. The earliest transmissions looked like Abraham Lincoln looming through a glass door and weren't very exciting. Luckily, it was a short step from there to the BBC's first Saturday night extravaganza, TV's opening night ceremony.
Vision and sound are on. The station goes on the air.
A mighty maze of mystic magic rays.
The show got a record audience of 400, the sort of viewing figures BBC4 still dreams of. Despite its popularity, the BBC was causing controversy from the start, and the powers that be were suspicious of it. Why did the government start the BBC in the first place? It seems like these days they're always trying to close it down. Was it one of those stupid mistakes they made, like Brexit?
The government didn't strictly start the BBC. The BBC was originally a private company in 1922. It employed a rather fierce Scottish guy called John Reith. And people still talk about Reithian values and Reithian broadcasting. Reithian values were to inform, educate, and entertain.
What, all at the same time?
Yeah.
Since those early days of black and white tat, the BBC has grown throughout the years to become one of the biggest programme shitting machines in the world, making groundbreaking, iconic programmes which still try to inform, educate or entertain. So the BBC is supposed to inform, educate or entertain.
And entertain.
I'm going to list some BBC things and I want you to say whether they inform, educate or entertain. OK. News at 10.
Inform.
Open University.
Educate.
Doctor Who.
Entertain.
Strictly Come Dancing.
Entertain.
Holmes Under the Hammer.
Entertain.
Inspector Phillips.
What is Inspector Phillips?
Oh, I made that one up. That was just a trick question.
OK, well, it didn't work.
Sounds real, though, doesn't it? Inspector Phillips.
No, I instantly knew that it wasn't a real one.
Eat Well for Less. It's where Greg Wallace and another man see how much a family spend on a week's shopping and then criticise them. Make them eat porridge from Lidl.
Inform.
Well done. Sorry, I wasn't totting up the scores.
Thank you.
But this golden future of television would have to wait, because back in 1939 times, the TV signals were suddenly switched off because someone decided to start another war to end all wars. When he became leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler was a funny-looking character with silly hair, a bit like Boris Johnson, but he turned out to be a hateful maniac who would let nothing get in the way of his ambition, a bit like Boris Johnson. Hitler believed the Germans were an elite race, like the Grand Prix. He also thought he owned Poland, and when he went round there to get it back, Britain cried war.
This country is at war with Germany.
Luckily, Britain had a hero on its side, a man whose name will never be forgotten, Winston Churchill.
Churchill's speeches were stirring and powerfully erotic.
We know it will be hard. We expect it will be long.
He was one of the greatest orators of all time, and some of the phrases he used still resonate today, such as finest hour, never surrender, and of course, we shall fight them bitches. And we needed Churchill's stirring mumbling, because at first the war didn't go well. Within 6 months, France was occupied by the Nazis, who they didn't see coming because they'd been expecting the Germans. Hitler wanted to make Britain German, to match its royal family, but the RAF held Hitler's forces back in amazing dogfights in the sky that were done by aeroplanes, not actual flying dogs, which sadly science still hasn't invented yet. This was the Battle of Britain. It seems amazing that these young men could fly and fight so well. Although when you look, you'll see the planes had tiny targets and crosses drawn on the side, which made them easier to hit. But planes weren't only used in dogfights. The Germans changed tactics. Instead of attacking planes, which could move out the way, they attacked the ground, which couldn't, in something called the Blitz.
Preceded by a shower of flares, German bombers rained fire and high explosive bombs in their most savage attack on London.
Hitler's pilots started dropping bombs, sort of aeroplane poos, and people had to hide from them. They built big tin shelters in their gardens or ran down the nearest tube station without a ticket or a valid Oyster card. Countless houses were reduced to big piles of bricks and wood, which is sort of what houses are anyway, but in a different order. Despite this, thanks to the plucky British spirit, people weren't totally down in the dumps, even if they lived in one. People sang songs during World War II to keep their spirits up, didn't they? How loud did they have to sing to be heard over the bombs?
Well, especially as they would have sometimes been in underground stations, sheltering from the bombs. It would have been loud in the underground station, the singing, if everybody was singing together, but it's true, you wouldn't have been heard much.
I wonder if when they sang, they used to time their singing with the explosions. That would be a fun thing to do.
It would be difficult. It'd be very difficult to time it. It's quite random, the falling of bombs.
In the war, there were lots of songs taking the piss out of Hitler, weren't there? How come they don't sing those sorts of songs anymore?
Well, he's not around anymore, so it's not so amusing.
Where is he?
Well, he's dead.
He's dead?
Yes.
Oh, right, so it'd be disrespectful to
Well, not
speak
so much
ill of him.
disrespectful as pointless, really.
Pointless.
A bit pointless.
Yeah. A lot of singing was needed because even when the Blitz ended, the war was far from over. There were many huge battles to come, most of which will never be forgotten because they've since been converted into blockbuster movies. How was it we beat the Germans at Dunkirk in War II, but still didn't win the whole war?
Well, first of all, I think we've got to stop calling it War II. I mean, it's the Second World War if you're American, and you have to have it this way, it's World War II. But, you know, that's the language we tend to use. But in terms of Dunkirk, I think that's the wrong way round. We actually lose at Dunkirk.
We lost at Dunkirk?
We lost at Dunkirk. I
don't think so. It turns out Dunkirk was a huge disaster. Like most sequels, War II was proving less fun than War I.
What made the war harder was that we didn't know what the Germans were planning, because they said it in a sort of code language known as German.
It took a team of British boffins using a magic typewriter called the Enigma machine literally loads of time to crack it, but crack it they did.
And with Germany's secrets twatted wide open, Britain and its allies were able to organise D-Day and invade France, but in a nice way.
In grueling and exciting scenes like these, expertly depicted in the pulse-quickening video game Call of Duty 2, soldiers scrambled out of their boats, looking for power-ups and health kits, terrified every second that a Nazi bullet might kill them, forcing them to respawn several feet away and be delayed by a number of seconds. Eventually the British won, and immediately there was widespread jubilation and people dancing about in black and white and getting off with people who were almost certainly dead now. A new, hopeful era had dawned, an era which 41 years later included the BBC painting and decorating television sitcom Brushstrokes.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
After the war, returning soldiers rewarded national hero Winston Churchill by voting him out of office. And the Britain that Britain came home to was a smaller Britain than the Britain had left. The empire was crumbling. Places like India decided they weren't British after all, which was sad because those countries had lots in common with us. They had the same person on the stamps, they spoke the same language, they were the same colour on maps. But despite all that, they chose to act as if they weren't part of Britain, just because that was geographically true. What's more, around the world, superpowers like Russia and China were on the rise. The future looked more uncertain than ever, and in 1948, one man wrote a book full of chilling predictions about just how terrible that future might be.
This is the book, George Orwell's chilling classic, 1984.
In the book, using nothing but words, Orwell depicts a world in which people are manipulated by screens, manipulated by the media, manipulated by the government. Something which thankfully didn't and couldn't happen. Although 1984 is set in the year 1984, it's not a 1984 anyone who lived through it would recognise. Orwell didn't predict Band-Aid or Ghostbusters, or Radio 1's Mike Reed banning Frankie Goes to Hollywood for singing about spunk.
In fact, almost the only thing he got right was that there'd be a thing on the screens called Big Brother, and even then he didn't predict that it would eventually be on Channel 5.
Orwell's scary vision spooked Britain so much, it tried to avoid a nightmare future by reinventing itself, and the government was going to help. The post-war Labour government was one of the most radical ever, kind of a cross between Jeremy Corbyn and the Taliban.
A landslide swept Labour to power, with a majority unexpected even by its own leaders.
They were seen as the biggest architects of something called the welfare state. Where is the welfare state?
Where is it?
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of all around us.
Yeah, but where specifically in Britain?
The welfare state is a phrase that refers to, broadly, the help that government gives to all of us.
The welfare state helps people from the cradle to the grave. So is it just for people lying down?
It certainly helps people lying down.
They help to, you know, they give out
bits and bobs, don't they?
Yes, they for poorer people, they provide a lot of
Schools
help.
and housing
and benefit payments, top-ups to your wages if you're
How did they
working.
decide what not to give out for free? Like, was there ever a plan to give out free crisps?
I don't think they've ever given out or thought about giving out free crisps, although I quite like crisps.
I love crisps.
I don't think many people would argue that you can't have a decent life without free crisps.
I think I'd kill myself if I couldn't have crisps.
As part of its reforms, the government introduced the National Health Service, or NHS for less long.
On July 5th, the new National Health Service starts, providing hospital and specialist services, medicines, drugs and appliances.
Once the NHS arrived, if you were poor and you got sick, you weren't on your own anymore. You were in a crowded waiting room full of other sick people. Suddenly, you could see a doctor free of charge, like you can every Saturday evening on BBC One. But staffing all those hospitals wasn't going to be easy, so Britain looked abroad for help. In 1948, the government granted British citizenship to everyone living in Commonwealth countries, a sort of reverse Brexit, or TIC-SERB. And a few months later, 492 migrants made the journey from the Caribbean to Britain on board the Empire Windrush, which was a sort of sea car or boat. The newcomers soon discovered life in Britain was very different to Jamaica. It was colder, wetter. We had potatoes instead of posh fruits. But they soon settled into a British way of life, not smiling and being permanently tired. Britain was becoming multicultural, although not everyone was happy. Not even racists, who at long last had someone new to hate, apart from Jews, Italians, Spaniards, women, the Irish, the French and the poor. Because far-right Facebook groups hadn't been invented yet, the only way racists could express their fury was to take part in race riots, which are sort of artisan pop-up festivals of hatred. Today, racist bigotry has no place in contemporary Britain, except Kent.
Britain was welcoming a new era, and it was about to get something mega new, a new monarch.
The royal family had experienced a rough few decades. Before the war, King Edward had abdicated so he could spend more time in his mistress. His brother George also vacated the throne unexpectedly early to spend more time in his coffin. This meant his eldest daughter Elizabeth was to be the new female king at the age of just 25.
Now the Princess Elizabeth we knew and loved returns amongst us as our queen.
For centuries, the coronation of a monarch was a sacred event that took place behind closed doors, just like a visit to the toilet, but more dignified than that makes it sound.
But now, thanks to progress, everyone was allowed to peek behind those closed doors. In 1953, millions of Britons watched the Queen being coronationed on their new televisions.
It must have been like watching The Crown on Netflix, but live and actually happening. Like Britain's Got Talent, but more serious. Like Game of Thrones, but set in the real world. And starring Queen Elizabeth, like The Crown again. Afterwards, incredibly, people didn't take the TVs back when they found there weren't any more coronations on. They kept them in the front rooms and never went out again.
As well as a new Queen, the nation had got itself a new Prime Minister. Britain was changing so fast that the only way to tell what country it was to keep getting everyone to wave flags. The national mood was shifting. It's the 1950s, a time of great change. The war's over, the NHS has been founded, the coronation's on TV, Mario 64's redefined the platform game for a new generation, and Anthony Eden's Prime Minister. How did Britain feel about these things?
Well, I don't think computer games had been invented by the 1950s. The other things, I mean, the population was pretty positive about the coronation. That was a cause for excitement. Anthony Eden perhaps less successful with the Suez crisis.
What was up with the sewers? Did someone try to flush something that was awful?
No, the Suez Canal.
What, the canals used to be sewers? That's disgusting.
No, Suez. It's a place.
All right. During this Suez crisis, events in Suez reached crisis point. More research needed. Make sure script amended before voiceover record.
And it wasn't just grown men who were causing trouble. A new form of human being called the teenager was evolving.
Teenagers were creatures that looked like adults, yet had the minds of children. like professional footballers do today.
And the young generation as a whole was about to deliver Britain a series of shocks that would shock it right up the shock box.
On the next and final episode of Cunk on Britain, I'll see how the groovy young people of the 1960s encouraged Britain to tune over, turn off and drop up. And Britain experienced a golden age that sadly couldn't last. In the 1960s, if you switched your television on, you'd get Morecambe and Wise, Cilla Black, Bob Monkhouse, David Frost. But nowadays, they're all dead. Why is that?
Well, you just knew that she would. Beverly is forced to tell Carol the truth about Merc. Episodes Friday night at 10. And for company from BBC Three, head to BBC iPlayer for all the episodes from Series 1 and 2 of This Country now.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads, and its people are asking questions. Now we've got our country back. What actually is it? Who are we and why?
The best way to find out where Britain's heading is to look behind us into something called history, a sort of rear-view mirror for time. So that's where I'm going, back there.
It's a journey that'll take me the length and width of the country. On my odyssey, I'll be starting sentences in one location
and finishing them in another.
And looking at some of the biggest faces in British history and asking other people's faces about them. What was the difference between punk rock and just being angry but without a guitar? All of it taking place in this sceptred isle we call home. So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom.
This is Cunk on Britain.
Throughout this series, I've been on a journey up through Britain's history.
Now I'm almost at the end of that road, at the point where olden times end and now times begin. A time when the archive footage goes colour at long fucking last, and some things you might have actually heard of happened. It's the story of how Britain went from the 1960s to this very moment now. And this moment, and this one, and also this, and found itself here and now at the arse end of history.
Britain had been uptight ever since Victorian times, and having 2 world wars on top of that had really knocked the fun out of everyone. Men had to wear bowler hats issued by the government, and their only form of entertainment was reading boring newspapers.
They weren't even allowed to get erections and had to make do with a stiff upper lip instead.
Meanwhile, women had to stay at home washing clothes, raising hundreds of children by hand and agreeing with their husbands. The only form of personal expression they were allowed was wearing pointy glasses.
But all that was about to change, thanks to 4 boys from Liverpool, George, Ringo and their guitarists, a pop band called the Beatles.
Some brave volunteers among the British police elect to act with heroism above and beyond the call of duty and escort the Beatles to their car.
These Beatles didn't have 6 legs, they had 8 legs, like a spider. Everywhere they went, girls screamed, like with a spider. But unlike spiders, the Beatles never crawled into anyone's mouth when they were asleep. Instead, they sang, which scientists claim spiders don't. The Beatles started from humble beginnings. In the early days, they couldn't afford individual haircuts and had to copy and paste the same one onto each of their heads. And they had to share a microphone to save money. But their catchy jingles were so infectious, they soon led to an epidemic called Beatlemania.
And the Beatles wanted to hold your hand, which only made the disease spread faster.
Soon it spread across the Atlantic to America, a country which was still there.
There are rumours around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party.
While the Beatles were in the USA, they started to become influenced by the hippies, which were sort of American wombles. They experimented with a drug called Luzd, which made the users see and hear things that weren't really happening. A bit like Netflix, their music turned psychopathic. Rather than churning out more simple love songs, thanks to psychopathic drugs, the Beatles began to sing about deeper, more meaningful things.
We all live in a yellow submarine.
The Beatles created some incredible music whilst they were on drugs. Did they not have dope testing back then? How come they weren't disqualified from the charts?
Well, as a matter of fact, there were songs they did that the BBC, who in those days were most of the radio stations, thought were references to drug taking, so they did ban them from the charts.
It's weird that the Beatles' LSD songs are so happy, isn't it? Because LSD isn't always a happy experience. Like, my mate Paul met this Italian couple whilst he was backpacking, and they invited him back to their room for a threesome, and they gave him some LSD, and when they got there, the bloke one pulled a screwdriver on him and made him shit in his own shoe and eat it, whilst the woman one filmed it. And that's a side of drug use that Paul McCartney doesn't sing about, isn't it?
No, well, I think luckily that kind of experience never came his way.
During one Luzd expedition, or trip, the Beatles became the first Britons to discover the existence of colour. And like Sir Walter Raleigh and his potatoes, they took the discovery home to the UK, where it caught on like hotcakes of wildfire.
Britain went overnight from grey to groovy.
Suddenly it was cool to ignore society and just be whoever you wanted to be, as long as you had fashionable hair and flamboyant clothing like everyone else.
A pearl mink miniskirt. Must be tailor-made for the freeze.
Were miniskirts actually shorter, or did they just appear that way because people's legs were getting longer?
They were actually quite a lot shorter, and they got shorter as the 60s went on.
Was there a miniskirt for men? You know, like trousers that just stopped under the balls?
No, there wasn't a miniskirt for men.
That seems like a shame.
For whom?
For men, so they didn't feel left out, you know. And it must be nice to have that sort of air circulating. But it wasn't just clothes that were changing. The sexual revolution was coming, and the country was lapping it up. Most of the change was due to this: the pill. A condom you could eat, a sort of get-out-of-child-free card that meant at last women could have sex for fun with any man of their choosing for 2 or 3 minutes, until he spaffed off, rolled over and went to sleep. Some women were having so much sex they decided to burn their bras because it was quicker than putting them on and taking them off all the time. Free love was all the rage. Thanks to the pill, sex was turned on its head, and its back, and over the table. People let it all hang out, like your dad doing the gardening in loose shorts. And the law was catching up with the times. For years, homosexuality was illegal, and gay men were sent to prison, where as punishment they'd have to share a tiny room with a man for years. But in the 60s, same-sex sex was decriminalised. It was a time of liberation. Soon, everyone in Britain was swinging, except convicted murderers, because hanging had just been abolished. For the first time ever, Britain was cool, not just the weather. Britain even decided to be cool at sport. England, the posh bit of Britain, brought back memories of the war by beating the Germans again. This time they bounced a ball into a net rather than a bomb into a dam, killing far fewer civilians and coining the infamous phrase, "They think it's all over," presented by Nick Hancock. Things were really locking up.
But the fun, like a Toblerone, couldn't last forever. And almost as quickly as the 60s had arrived, they were over. Give or take 10 years. And now it was the 1970s' turn to happen.
The 1970s was a time of great change, and the first change was the economy. Britain had a new Prime Minister, Edward Heath. With his love of yachts, classical music and church organs, Edward Heath seemed to be a real man of the people. But Heath soon found himself facing a financial crisis, the likes of which the world only sees about every 10 years or so. Thanks to inflation, prices were getting bigger, while wages were getting smaller. The country was in chaos. Britain was said to have the British disease, and there was no known cure, apart from not to be Britain anymore, which is why Ted Heath insisted we should become part of Europe.
Soon Britain entered the European Common Market in what should have been called Brentrance, but wasn't.
It was so perfect, we held a referendum to check whether Britain should stay in Europe.
Yes is now showing at 67% and the no vote at 33%.
And it turned out everybody was happy with the idea, as a majority secretly are today, but daren't mention. But things were still rubbish. There was rising unemployment, widespread industrial action, and an energy crisis, which meant for the first time people had to justify how much electricity they were using.
But elsewhere on the estate, 1 bar of an electric fire was heating a defiant old-age pensioner.
If we don't need 2 bars on, well, we don't have 2 bars on. If we need 2 bars on, then put 2 bars on. It's logic, it's human nature.
So if the weather suddenly turns very cold again, you're probably going to have to put the other bar on,
I'll put the other bar on and a reflector. I'll have the lot on.
Soon power cuts became all the rage. Because the lights kept going out at a moment's notice, plunging everyone into darkness, there was no point dressing nicely. And as a result, the world of fashion decided to simply give up. Every item of clothing in the world went off overnight, and the sickness spread to haircuts, which caught Dutch elm disease and became horribly disfigured. Even the air in the sky started to look dingy and awful, and like it was all filmed underwater. To cap it all, in Northern Ireland, a civil war was breaking out, but so as not to scare anyone, they didn't call it a civil war, they just called it the Troubles, like it was a tummy bug or something. People were angry, and all that pent-up fury had to go somewhere. Conditions were ripe for a musical explosion known as punk. As you can see from this searing performance, the punks were antisocial, cynical and dangerous. And no punk band was bigger or more shockinger than the Sex Pistols. They had shocking names like Johnny Bottom and Sid Nickers, and they wore shocking homemade clothes and put hankies on their heads, hence their famous call to arms, handkerchiefs in the UK. But the most shocking thing they did was swearing on TV, an incident so outrageous that in the time since it first happened, it's only ever been seen again 300 or maybe 400 times in music documentaries.
It's what? Nothing, a rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
Was it really? Good heavens.
The Sex Pistols were fired, weren't they, as TV presenters? What was all that about?
Well, I think the thing about the Sex Pistols were that they had a lot of impact because they got a lot of, shock value and sensation in the papers and on telly. And they helped really launch the movement to punk because everybody knew about what they were up to.
But I don't understand why they got fired on the telly.
Well, they swore.
Oh, right, yeah. OK. That was quite shocking back then, wasn't it?
Back then it was.
Not now, though,
No.
really. Now
No, you
you'd have
wouldn't.
to do something much bigger, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You'd have to, do a poo on the one show or something.
Yes.
And then
Even then, you might not get fired.
what if you sort of then hike your trousers up without even wiping? But punk wasn't the only sign the country had gone to the dogs. In 1978, literally everyone went on strike in the winter of discomfort. Even punks went on strike, refusing to put on their punk uniforms and instead dressing like normal people. Something had to be done. So it was decided to start the 1980s a year early with the election of a new Prime Minister in 1979. Margaret Thatcher, street name Mrs.
Her Majesty, the Queen, has asked me to form a new administration.
Thatcher's election was a watershed. It proved that absolutely anyone could become Prime Minister, provided they went to Oxford and married a millionaire. As well as a uterus, Mrs. Thatcher had a vision. An economic vision with all coins up it. She believed in laissez-faire economics, which is French for something, and then English again for the economics bit. OK, let's pretend it's the 1980s, and I'm Margaret Thatcher. This is a political interview. What would you ask me?
I think I would start by asking if this was the early part of her period in office, why she was setting interest rates so high, why she was allowing the exchange rate to go so high in a way that was really damaging British industry and causing a huge rise in unemployment, and didn't she think that she was causing huge unnecessary suffering?
You're not expecting me to answer that, seriously. Mrs. Thatcher had saved the nation from chaos with her tough economic policies, and a grateful nation erupted into lively street parties. The sense of jubilation continued during the royal wedding of the century. It was a dream come true, as the then future and still future King of England, the Prince of Charles, married one of the 3 people in his marriage, the future Queen of Hearts, Lady Diana Frank Spencer, in a wedding just like something from a fairy tale, except without a wolf or dwarfs or a beanstalk, or a happy ending.
But while people waved flags like idiots at home, trouble was brewing overseas, at a faraway corner of foreign Britain known as the Isle of Falklands Island.
This island was invaded by Argentinas, who'd mistaken it for an identical island they'd left lying around in exactly the same place a few centuries ago. Mrs. Thatcher immediately fought back by bravely ordering troops to fight and die on her behalf. And soon, that famous flag, the Union Jack, was flying over the Isle of Falklands Island once again. Beating the Argentines at war sealed Mrs. Thatcher's reputation as a tough guy so much that people started to call her the Iron Lady, and she soon got another chance to prove how hard she was, not in a major war, but a minor strike. During Mrs. Thatcher's reign, there was the miners' strike, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Why was it considered minor?
It wasn't considered minor, it was a strike by miners, people who go, underground and dig out coal.
Right. What's a mine?
So a mine is the underground construction where you dig out the coal.
Right. What's coal?
So coal is this black rock that you burn.
Right. And that's grown underground.
And that's underground.
So the miners go in the mine.
They do.
And they get the coal.
And they get the coal.
And then they went on strike.
Yeah.
The miners struck their strike in 1984, led by their leader, Arthur Scarface.
If we've got to stop out, well, November or December, we'll beat this coal board and go.
Thatcher refused to back down, and soon the two sides were at war. A class war. The rich police on their horses in their smart uniforms, and the poor dirty miners fighting with bits of coal.
It was like something out of the Russian Revolution, except it was happening here, in Britain, somewhere near you, if you live near a mine.
The miners' strike, perhaps the most bitter dispute Britain had seen in years, tore generations apart before ending in 1985, one whole year before the terrestrial broadcast premiere of the BBC sitcom Brushstrokes.
Because of you, these things I do. Because of you. Because of you. Oh.
With the miners crushed, like miners in a bad mine, Thatcher was free to pursue her economic dreams by privatising some of Britain's biggest assets. Thanks to the big sell-off, anyone could get rich, providing they had loads of spare money already, a system still in use to this day. Suddenly, having money was cool, and no one had more money than the yuppies, or young urban twats. To be a 1980s yuppie, did you have to qualify as a wanker first and then just work your way up?
I think some people identified as yuppies, but it was also, I think, used as an insult in the 1980s.
I've seen footage of yuppies holding filofaxes and mobile phones. Are they still in that footage? Or where are they now?
Where are they now? Well, they're sort of 30 years older now, so...
So they're not in that footage anymore?
Well, that footage is historical, so...
So if you look back at that footage, it'll just be empty?
No, the
because
footage...
that person has now left?
No, the footage is a recording of what happened in the past. So the footage stays the same, but those people, we don't know what's happened to them.
But what of their filofaxes? What happened to them? It seemed like a golden age of twattery. But Thatcher's luck couldn't last forever. And as the 1990s approached, she got too ambitious by unveiling the controversial poll tax, a tax on people called Paul, and they were furious. Following a wave of protests, Thatcher wound up on her iron horse, leaving Downing Street crying tears down her face, which she'd never done before in case it rusted. The next Prime Minister, Major John, was as fearsome as he looked, and he presided over yet another depressing period of recession. Britain was in a right state, not only financially, but also economically and in money terms too. The only hope was that we could somehow paint and sing our way out. It was an art and culture renaissance, an era defined by Oasis, the Spice Girls, Swede, Chris Evans, Take This, Damien Hirst, The Proddy Guy, Trainspotting, Chris Evans, Mr Blobby, Jamie Oliver, Mopeds, Ironic Wanking, The Italian Job, Chris Evans and Chris Evans. But one name sums up the 90s better than anyone else: Blur. In the 1997 election, why do you think more people voted for Tony Blair than Oasis?
You're making a mistake which is quite common at the time, that because the Prime Minister or Labour Party leader at the time was called Tony Blair.
Blur.
Blair.
Blur.
Blair.
Blur.
Blair.
Blur.
Tony Blair was
Blur.
Blur. Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, and there was one of the biggest rock or pop bands of the time was Blur.
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 Yeah. It's hard to remember today, but Blur and Blur were actually two different things. Blur were a rock band locked into a notorious rivalry with Oasis. Oasis were rough and tumble lads from Manchester, whereas Blur were from art school, which is the opposite of Manchester, and that's why they hated each other. Tony Blair, meanwhile, was a guitarist and Dee Ream fan who reinvented the Labour Party and rode it to victory at the election. Blur hosted a party at Number 10, inviting lots of the Cool Britannia crowd and immediately making them much less cool. Anyone who was a massive prick was there, but the party atmosphere was interrupted by tragedy. Diana's death couldn't have come at a worse time for a nation that had just got really into being judgmental about her sex life. The sense of loss was shocking. It's hard to convey the atmosphere to younger viewers, although it's fair to say the general mood was... and also... But because emojis hadn't yet been invented, people had to cry with their faces. Millions looked to the Queen to pull a ceremonial sad face in solidarity. But with the monarch constitutionally forbidden to express emotion, their pleas fell on deaf tear ducts. Tony Blair stepped in to say what needed to be said. He called Diana the Peebles Princess.
She was the People's Princess.
Even though she wasn't from Peebles, she was from Norfolk. But sometimes the facts aren't as important as how something sounds. It was the first step on a post-pop career that turned the Prime Minister into a living saint, like Bono or Holly Willoughby. Through the 90s, Blair solved all the nation's problems: the economy, health, education, even the Irish troubles. There was nothing he couldn't do. But no sooner had the 21st century started happening than Blair dragged Britain into the war on terror. But the war in Iraq proved about as popular as infanticide-flavoured crisps, and Blair's legacy was well and truly shot through a bin bag. Blair slinked off to live inside a haunted mirror, leaving Number 10 under the stewardship of a man with all the carefree joie de vivre of a haunted cave in Poland, Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown knew mainly about coins, but that wouldn't help him because all the coins were about to implode. In a financial crisis, which would become known as the financial crisis. People queued outside banks in scenes of boring desperation. The world of money was broken and no one knew how to fix it.
Today, stock markets across the world tumbled, imploded, continued to collapse like deflated dirigibles.
People say the financial crisis happened because it just got too complicated, and it's all because of the maths. If we took maths out of the equation, it'd be much easier. Couldn't we use something else instead of numbers?
I think that actually you're right in a way, that there is too much maths in the way that people think about the economy. And one of the things that occasionally goes wrong is that economists think that they can build...
Let's go, girls.
Sorry about that. After Gordon Brown stuck a plaster on the economy and left, the country needed a strong leader, and luckily, one man stepped up to single-handedly save the nation. The finest Prime Minister Britain has ever had, a man whose name will never be forgotten, Davis Cameron. Davis Cameron skillfully almost won the 2010 election and formed a Brokeback Mountain-style coalition with the equally visionary and beloved Nick Clegg. Almost immediately, Britain's problems, apart from the economy and social injustice and all the other ones, were solved. And by 2011, everything was going swimmingly. There was even a new Diana in the form of Kate Middleton, who married King William in a high-definition reboot of the royal wedding. By the time the Olympics came to Britain, the country was riding the crest of a wave. Suddenly, it seemed like we could do anything if we put our mind to it, even stop mourning. It was a great time to be British. Unless you were Scottish. Scotland wasn't sure it wanted to be British anymore and thought being Scottish might be good enough.
Delegates, it's game on for Scotland.
It's funny, why do Scottish people hate the English when the English have absolutely no feelings at all about the Scots?
I suppose it's a bit like a marriage of an old couple. It's as though Scotland and England got married when they were young, and it's constantly under debate whether they're better off staying together for the sake of the pension and the house, or if they should get divorced.
Do you think England snores?
England looks to me like the kind of person that snores.
The Scots held something called a referendum, which is a way of asking the public what they want to happen and then actually taking them seriously, unlike in an election. In the end, Scotland voted to stay attached to England, using a system of fields and roads as before. But the referendum had been such a hit that Davis Cameron decided he wanted one too.
But this referendum would be about a different country, Europe.
And I will go to Parliament and propose that the British people decide our future in Europe.
It was a simple choice. Should Britain leave things as they were and stay part of Europe? Or alternatively, remain on its own and become part of England instead? One thing's for sure, Davis Cameron's referendum would stop anyone arguing about Europe ever again. When the sun rose on the 24th of June 2016, with it came the news that Britain had voted out. Brexit was happening, and everyone was delighted.
That is now statistically, mathematically there, that the Leave campaign have won.
The Brexit result shook everything up. Suddenly, Davis Cameron was out, Theresa May was in, and Jeremy Corbyn was sexually attractive. The future of Britain is now more uncertain than any point in the past, which is the opposite of its future. Right now, is Britain at an important moment in history, or a significant one?
I'd say really important.
Not significant.
Well, both.
What if you had to choose one?
Important.
Not significant.
Just because it's important doesn't mean they can be both. They can be important and significant.
Not in this.
Okay.
You have to choose one.
If I'm going to choose one,
yeah,
I'll choose important.
So it's not significant. Throughout this series, I've charted the story of Britain, and it's a story that ends here, with the country once again at a turning point between a rock and a harder rock. Closing one door with a foot in the past and opening another with an eye to the future. An eye that's looking at itself in the mirror and asking the question, what sort of massive country am I? Can the nation that withstood Romans, Vikings, plagues, great fires, rippers and Hitler survive itself? Will it draw upon the spirit of King Arthur, Lord Nelson, Queen Victoria, Charles Darwin and Andy Crane? Who will the Britain of tomorrow look like, and why? Britain didn't get to have a long history by ceasing to exist or being born yesterday. The one thing we can be sure of is that Britain is Britain, and it'll stay that way forever, until it's not.